Over the past 30 years, Castlevania has become one of gaming's most storied franchises. But with 32 different games in the core series, there are just as many missteps as masterpieces. That's why we're tracing the bloodline of Dracula and the Belmont family all the way from its lowest points to the dizzying heights of an inverted castle. Here's every Castlevania game ranked from worst to best. Vampire Killer. More than anything else, what made the original NES Castlevania a classic was its well-considered design. Without that thoughtfulness, it just wouldn't be great. And we know that because we have Vampire Killer from 1986. While the series would later find huge success by focusing on exploration, this game for the MSX2 computer was full of awkward stages that looped endlessly until you found a key that would allow you to progress, sacrificing the original game's linear clarity and memorable progression. It's not the most crushingly bad example of a Castlevania game, but it's definitely the most tedious. Haunted Castle. The 1988 arcade remake of the original Castlevania is not without its merits. While it doesn't look as good as some of its contemporaries, and the hilariously tiny rendering of a Simon Belmont who's half the size of a chair doesn't help, the graphical capabilities of the arcade allowed Haunted Castle to do some pretty interesting stuff. Unfortunately, that's about where the fun stops. Haunted Castle is brutally, unfairly difficult with terrible controls that make it virtually unplayable. Castlevania: Order of Shadows. If you've never heard of Order of Shadows, there's a good reason for that. It's a little-known entry into the series from 2007 released for mobile phones, and is about as good as you'd expect. While it touted itself as a mobile successor to Symphony of the Night, it featured half-hearted action RPG mechanics, awkward controls, and a minuscule roster of monster enemies that topped out at 13 types of creepy foes in the whole game. In a world where games like ARIA of Sorrow exist, Order of Shadows is absolutely pointless. The Game Boy years. In the 21st century, handheld systems like the Nintendo DS would be the home for the true bloodline of Castlevania. But on the original Game Boy, the best thing you can say about them is that they got slightly better as they went on. 1989's Castlevania: The Adventure had some decent action, but was tanked from the first moments by muddy graphics and a hero who moved across his time-limited stages at glacial speed. 1991 brought Castlevania II: Belmont's Revenge, and while it was certainly an improvement over its predecessor, how could it not be? Its most notable feature was the addition of a Mega Man-style stage select, but it came out the same year as the much better Super Castlevania IV on the SNES, raising the question of why'd you even bother? Finally, we have Castlevania Legends from 1997. It's definitely the least loved entry in the Game Boy's Belmont trilogy, to the point where Koji Igarashi removed it from the official timeline and once called it an embarrassment. All things considered, it's not that bad. It captures the feel of a classic Castlevania much better than its predecessors, and Sonia Belmont marked the first time that the games had featured a female protagonist. Kid Dracula. Kid Dracula was one of those part sequel, part remakes that were so popular when gaming franchises shifted over to the Game Boy, and it's also the only time American audiences got to play as Little Dracula. It's mostly notable for its boss fights, and while they never quite get as bizarre as they did in the Japan-only counterpart, battling it out with a shotgun blasting Jason Voorhees is pretty wild. Also, since the American translation says Kid Dracula is regular Dracula's son, that means that this is actually Alucard's origin story.
What?
That's pretty weird, right? Castlevania. Before you get mad, relax. We're not talking about the original. This is 1999's Castlevania for Nintendo 64, which is unquestionably the worst main series Castlevania game ever made. It's not entirely without redeeming qualities. There's some good music and a few of the boss fights are interesting, but that's canceled out by awful controls, an infuriating camera, and bland, blocky levels. Konami tried for a solid decade to make a 3D Castlevania happen, but with a first step like this, it's shocking there was ever a second one. Castlevania: Legacy of Darkness. If you liked Castlevania for Nintendo 64, and be honest, you didn't, then we've got some good news. About 9 months after it originally came out, someone over at Konami decided that maybe they should go back and finish making it. The result was Legacy of Darkness, a kind of sequel/remake of their first try. It put the focus on a few other characters, and it's a far better experience than the letdown that was Castlevania 64, but it's by no means a good game. A better version of Castlevania 64 still had no hope of being good. Castlevania: Judgment. Of all the games to bear the Castlevania name, 2008's Judgment might be the weirdest. It's a cross-time fighting game that pulls in characters from throughout the history of the franchise, gives them redesigns by the artist of Death Note, and drops them into interactive environments to fight to the death. Seems like a good idea, right? Unfortunately, the road to a terrible game is often paved with good intentions. The Wii's motion controls made playing an awkward chore, and Takeshi Obata's redesigns aren't great, and occasionally downright embarrassing. It's interesting for its novelty, but almost impossible to recommend. Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest. The best thing you can say about Simon's Quest is that it has some good ideas. It just fails to put any of them together in a way that's fun. The open-ended world, the first steps toward action RPG mechanics, the mysteries to figure out, and even the day-night cycle. All fantastic elements that would serve as a prototype for what a 21st century Castlevania game would be. But in 1988, they were clunky to the point of being nearly unplayable. Throw in a poor translation that introduced the world to the graveyard duck, and it's just a fundamentally bad game, despite elements that were a decade ahead of their time. Akumajo Special: Boku Dracula-kun. As a standard issue 8-bit platformer, Dracula-kun is okay, but as a bizarre artifact of its time, it's a must-play. It's really just a Castlevania title in name only, with a few vague connections to the series, but by the time you get to a boss fight that's just the Statue of Liberty asking you game show questions, that hardly even matters anymore. It's a little surprising that it only took a few years for the Castlevania franchise to descend into full-on parody, but Boku Dracula-kun is surprisingly fun and monumentally weird. Castlevania: Circle of the Moon. Circle of the Moon is so close to being a great game, but close only counts in horseshoes and holy water. On the plus side, this 2001 offering has a killer soundtrack, a great castle layout, and a cool story. Unfortunately, it's also saddled with a protagonist who needs a special move to run faster than a snail. Its graphics would have been great on a console, but failed on the Game Boy Advance's notoriously murky screen. To make matters worse, the DS's attack system had interesting ideas, but in practice resulted in endless grinding that just wasn't fun. Castlevania: The Adventure ReBirth. You should never play Castlevania: The Adventure. If, however, you absolutely need to, like maybe you got sentenced to it for a minor crime, the 2009 remake is the version to play. This Wii-exclusive title boasted updated graphics and controls and all the shiny bells and whistles you'd expect by now. It's a solid attempt that actually fixes a lot of what went wrong with the original Adventure, but it also raises the question, if you're going to remake any Castlevania game in 2009, why this one? Castlevania: Lords of Shadow – Mirror of Fate. 2013's Mirror of Fate is not a good game, but you have to respect its audacity. It mixes inspiration from Castlevania 3 with the grimness of Lords of Shadow, asking players to fight through a castle with different characters whose abilities open up different pathways. Unfortunately, the castle itself is boring and counterintuitive, and playing through the same bad environments 3 times as different heroes is about as fun as it sounds. Beyond that, its twists to the mythology are unintentionally hilarious. It picks up on the idea of what if a Belmont was Dracula? If Trevor Belmont is Gabriel's son, and Gabriel is Dracula, then Trevor must also be Alucard, which means Alucard is Simon Belmont's dad, which means…
You are not the father.
If you love the mythology of Castlevania, it's almost worth playing to get the jaw-dropping nonsense of the reveals. Castlevania: Lament of Innocence. Of all the attempts to give an origin story for the Belmont family that would explain why they use a whip to fight vampires, 2003's Lament of Innocence was probably the most ill-advised. The straightforward action gameplay does a good job of translating what's great about the side-scrolling games into a 3D space, but it's saddled with some voice acting that verges on hilariously bad.
But I am beloved by the night. You will taste my powers.
I'll kill you and the night!
The worst part, the origin of the vampire killer whip, in which you have to kill your fiancée so that her soul can bond with your whip to make it more powerful. It's one of gaming's most egregious examples of literally turning a woman into an object. Castlevania: Curse of Darkness. Curse of Darkness took everything Lament of Innocence did well and did it better. The action is more fluid, the boss fights are bigger and more exciting, and the plot is far less bizarre than the previous entry in the franchise. It's clearly Castlevania trying to do what Devil May Cry had already done better, but that's not really a bad thing. It still has that hilarious acting, though.
It's the curse! Dracula's curse!
Castlevania: Harmony of Despair. As an online co-op action platformer, 2010's Harmony of Despair pits a team of vampire hunters against remixed greatest hits versions of the castle, rushing against a time limit to take down a boss. While its novelty is quick to wear off, and while it lacks any sort of interesting solo mode, it does a great job with its simple premise, and makes the most of seeing characters from throughout the series teaming up. Much like Judgment, this one's an unusual experiment. The difference is that this time, it still feels like Castlevania. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. 2014's Lords of Shadow 2 seems like the easiest high concept in the world to sell to Castlevania fans. In a modern-day setting with looming gothic architecture and massive bosses, you play as Dracula to fight the only thing worse than he is, Satan himself. In practice, the plot makes no sense. Dracula's more of a sad sack than a tragic hero, and while we're sure Mercury Steam spent a long time on those gothic aesthetics, the game's so dark that they sure don't seem to want us to see any of it. It's not terrible, but instead of giving us a modern Castlevania, it was more like, what if Bayonetta had no sense of humor? Akumajo, Dracula, Castlevania Chronicles. Your opinion of Castlevania Chronicles depends on if you think the original game would be better if it boasted 16-bit graphics and a synthwave soundtrack. If so, this is the game for you. Originally released in 1993 in Japan as Akumajo Dracula, it's essentially an updated reimagining of the 1986 classic. It's a curiosity from a time when going back to the NES through virtual consoles and emulation wasn't really possible, but it didn't get an American release until it came out for PlayStation in 2001. By then, it felt dated, and not in the cool retro way. Super Castlevania 4. 1991's first Super Nintendo installment of the Castlevania franchise is often regarded as one of the console's best action games. Looking back on it from today, though, it's not flawless. That doesn't mean it's not great. It builds on what had been established in the first 3 games, and elements like the rotating rooms were a great showcase of what a 16-bit console could do. At the same time, the easier action lost some of the thoughtfulness of the original. It's definitely worth playing and absolutely worthy of its spot on the SNES Classic, but there are other games in the series that deliver a much better experience. Castlevania Bloodlines. Rating the Genesis take on Castlevania higher than the SNES version might strike some as heresy, but 1994's Bloodlines is an underrated gem. For all its accomplishments, Super Castlevania 4 is just a new take on the original NES Castlevania with shiny new technology. Bloodlines, on the other hand, is all new. It sends 2 playable characters on a world tour set against the backdrop of World War I, with interesting set pieces that all leads to a final boss fight where you literally beat the bones out of the devil. Castlevania Rondo of Blood Dracula-X. If you've only ever played the SNES version of Dracula-X, you're missing out on one of the best entries in the entire franchise. Rondo of Blood is arguably the finest classic-style Castlevania game, boasting varied stages like the pitching ghost ship, awesomely powerful item crashes, alternate paths, and even a sweet anime-style opening sequence. Unfortunately, it was only ever released in Japan on the PC Engine, meaning it's far less well-known than its SNES counterpart. As good as Rondo is, Dracula-X is the definition of just okay, bringing their combined place on the list way down. Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. 2002's Harmony of Dissonance was a pretty clear response to all the criticisms of Circle of the Moon. The colors can get distractingly brighter, and the magic system is simplified. Unfortunately, the gimmick of having 2 different castles with identical layouts resulted in a map that was a huge pain to navigate. The idea of revealing it slowly through visual cues and holding back the characters actually spelling it out was cool, but it was mostly a reminder that the series had done better things before. Castlevania Lords of Shadow. After over a decade of trying to get a 3D Castlevania to work, Lords of Shadow actually managed to pull it off. As a grim and gritty reboot of the franchise, it leaned into a ludicrously over-the-top and relentlessly self-serious aesthetic with a wild twist ending. You're not fighting Dracula, you are Dracula, and it's happening in the present day. It's a fun game that gets a lot right, but ultimately did it too late. By 2010, we already had Batman Arkham Asylum, and that game's focus on a cohesive, threatening, gothic location with stage-opening items gave players a better 3D Castlevania feel than we ever got from Castlevania itself. Castlevania. The original Castlevania from 1986 is nothing short of an 8-bit masterpiece, even if it lifts from some obvious places. Simon Belmont is basically just Conan the Barbarian with Indiana Jones's whip fighting classic movie monsters, with Medusa from Clash of the Titans thrown in for good measure. That said, every piece of the game is well considered. It's the kind of game where the action rewards patience and thinking ahead more than speed and button mashing, and made an incredible foundation for one of the greatest franchises in gaming. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse. Dracula's Curse is the game that brought in the blueprint for Castlevania's future. The multiple playable characters, an expanded Transylvania, and branching pathways were incredibly innovative, And unlike Castlevania II's good ideas, they were executed in ways that still feel interesting today. Despite a truly crushing difficulty curve that rivals even the originals, it's a fantastic ending to the NES Castlevania trilogy. Beyond the gameplay though, this was the first game that really expanded the mythology of the series. If nothing else, the introduction of Alucard would have a pretty huge impact on the series down the line. Castlevania: Order of Ecclesia. 2008's Order of Ecclesia looked to Simon's Quest for its inspiration, lifting some of its best elements from its extremely frustrating predecessor. The journey across Transylvania and a town full of mysterious villagers both prove that Castlevania II really was onto something back in the day. This time though, they did it right. Rather than constantly lying to you, the villagers offer up interesting quests and the different stages all have their own character. The glyph system adds an interesting twist to boss fights and led to one of the most interesting stories in the series. Castlevania: Portrait of Ruin. The gimmick in Portrait of Ruin is that you're simultaneously playing as two characters, Charlotte, a spellcaster, and Jonathan, who focuses on melee combat. While you only control one at a time, they can both fight on the screen simultaneously, which makes for some really clever gameplay. What's more, the castle serves as a hub for distinct stages hidden within paintings, allowing you to move through city streets and creepy abandoned schools without ever feeling like you're not playing Castlevania. If the stages in the back half of the game weren't so repetitive, it'd rank even higher. Castlevania: Aria of Sorrow. Of all the games that have tried to improve on what Symphony of the Night accomplished, Aria of Sorrow came closest in 2003. While it drew some criticism for the grinding necessary for collecting every enemy's soul and the occasionally pointless attack options that went with them, it made for a highly customizable game with plenty of rewards for your time. Aria also gave you a player character who is the reincarnation of Dracula himself, exploring a different side of the mythology. Soma's rejection of his dark legacy as a creature of chaos was compelling enough to carry two games built on a framework of great gameplay. Castlevania: Dawn of Sorrow. The difference between Dawn of Sorrow and Aria of Sorrow is so slim that you could argue for either one being superior to the other, but it really just comes down to hardware. While not every game took advantage of it, the Nintendo DS was a great system for the Metroidvania style. While the action took place on one screen, the crucial map could seamlessly be displayed on the other. Beyond that though, Dawn is just more of what Aria already did so well, and there's nothing wrong with that. Castlevania: Symphony of the Night. In 1997, Symphony of the Night reinvented the side-scrolling genre and brought the Vania to Metroidvania. It has tight and intuitive controls, a seemingly endless amount of weapons, armor, and equipment, massively powerful bosses, enough secrets to fill an encyclopedia, and a ton of beautiful touches that make it an incredible gaming experience. From Olrock silently sitting at a table inviting you to dine with him before a boss fight kicks off, to ghostly priests appearing in the chapel's confessional. It's a rewarding experience every time you play through it. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, there's also the mind-blowing reveal of the Inverted Castle, a sprawling second quest that doubles the length of the game and still stands as one of the best twists in video game history. Symphony of the Night isn't just the best Castlevania game, it has a legitimate claim on being one of the greatest video games of all time. Full stop.